Shir sponsored by Rabbi Michael and Jerry Laxmeter for the refuah shlema of their granddaughter Avigail Sarah Bat Shena Aharona. So this week's parsha is Parsha Terumah, and therefore the first pasuk is Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe Lemor, and the second pasuk Daber b'nei Yisrael bichuli Terumah. So the truth is, this kind of comes out of nowhere. Last thing we knew, we were minding our own business. Last thing we knew, we were having Matan Torah. So we've been down this path before. We've tried to understand the logic and the thematic sequence of what is taking place, and we know that there are at least two popular divergent approaches to what is taking place at this point. One approach is Rashi, and the other approach is the Ramban. It could be that Rashi gets exaggerated somewhat when people try to explain it as far as what he says, what he doesn't say, what he means, and what's working behind it. And we'll see. We're only going to deal with both of those opinions really in a most tangential manner. But what Rashi believes is that at this moment, and as we start Parsha Terumah, that we have completely abandoned the sequence of Sefer Shemot, or of the events which took place as they took place, and that in fact this Perek Kaf Hey, the instructions of building the Mishkan, are after the whole story of the Chet Egel, which are chapters down the line. And only afterwards does God, after he forgives the people, tells them to build the Mishkan. So therefore the Mishkan comes out as a kind of an unfortunate consequence of an unfortunate, well, maybe I misstated that, perhaps a fortunate consequence of an unfortunate event, and therefore once we are forgiven and once there is no greater hope at that point of continuation, then God gives us this thing to build, which is going to be a symbol of the forgiveness which we have. And maybe, again, perhaps, the highlight of forgiveness is going to be Yom Kippur. And just to keep in mind, they're actually forgiven on Yom Kippur. That's when Moshe comes down the second time, or perhaps the third time, depending on how you count. And then the Mishkan is going, that's what it's for. Yom Kippur, it's for the Mishkan, and the Mishkan is for Yom Kippur, and that really becomes the day of forgiveness or atonement. And perhaps all of that makes sense. And the Ramban has a completely different approach to this. The Ramban sees this as the logical extension, not of the Chet Egel, but for the Ramban, he sees it as the logical extension of Matan Torah. And by Matan Torah, there was a revelation. So as we move forward, we're going to need this ability of having a continuing type of a revelation of being God involved in our lives, and therefore the Mishkan is the continuation of Har Sinai. And he brings lots of psukim to try to prove this point. So as I said, there's two radically different approaches. So before we get to the third radical different approach from both of those, we're just going to consider a couple of verses here along the way. As we continue in source number 1, Perek Kaf Hey, Parsha Terumah, so not only told to bring gifts, we're told specifically, bring Zahav v'Kesef v'Nechoshet. So these are some precious metals, Tchelet, Argaman, Tulat Shani v'Sheish v'Izim, Orim, Elim, Adamim, Barot, Chashim, Vatzei Shitim. All of these things, be it metals, be it wood, skins, things which are going to be used, precious stones, Avnei Shom, Avnei Miluim, Vasuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, and make for me a sanctuary, and I will dwell within them. And of course, people note Vasuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, not b'tocha. And then as we continue, there's something that I do want to note, pay attention to. Pasuk Yudalid, Reveita et abadim b'tabaot al tzlaot ha'aron l'seit et ha'aron bahem. That this is not talking about the construction, rather this is talking about transportation. Which means, again, I'm not sure how much you thought about this or how much this was significant to you, but built in to the original instructions of building the Mishkan is we're talking about locomotion, we're talking about movement, we're talking about not a structure which stays in one place, but rather a place which moves with them, or a structure which moves this with them from place to place. L'seit et ha'aron bahem. V'natat et ha'aron et ha'edut asher teinei lecha, which, by the way, is the most functional reason imaginable for having a Mishkan, that Moshe is going to come down. This is certainly going to be according to the Ramban's approach. Moshe just now went up the first time. He's going to come down with luchot. So what do you do with luchot when you come down? So he's told, okay, you're going to need to make an ark, and then you're going to carry the ark as we go from place to place. So again, really a functional need for the Mishkan, independent of any kind of chet or egel or anything else, which, by the way, it's such a strong rationale that one has to then kind of ask themselves, hold it, according to Rashi, where are we going to put the luchot? How were they supposed to be transported? What was the procedure supposed to be? And I hope that you appreciate that is actually a really good question, but the functional use of the Mishkan, not just spiritual use, the functional use of the Mishkan is one we should note over here. And as we continue, we're told in Pasuk Kaf Bet, "V'no'adati l'chasham," and I will make myself known to you there. V'dibarti itchem be'al hakaporet, I'm going to communicate to you from on top of the kaporet me'ben shnei hakruvim asher al arona idut et kol asher atzaver otcha el bnei Yisrael. So Moshe is being told that this place will now become the epicenter of, I don't want to use the word holiness yet, but I want to say communication. The word of God, which came down by Sinai, is now going to come down in the Mishkan. So again, for the Ramban's understanding of a continual Har Sinai, just like God spoke at Sinai, now God's going to speak from the between the Kruvim as well. And as we skip a little bit lower to Pasuk Kaf Zayin, towards the end of the pasuk, it says to make these things, and I don't want to get into all the construction. L'sa'et et hashulchan. So just like we were told before about carrying the ark, the Aron, now we're being told that we need to build these things to carry the shulchan. So again, the movement, the carrying, is built into this. So what we're dealing with over here is the Mishkan is a traveling sanctuary which is going to go with them as the camp travels from place to place. On the other hand, in source number 2, moving towards Devarim, moving towards pre-entry to Eretz Yisrael, and of course there's a problem with saying that. The problem is, at this moment, if we are before the Chet Egel, aren't we also pre-entry Eretz Yisrael? Of course you could say pre-entry how far back, but again, it's more immediate. Which means you get to Sefer Devarim within, last year of Moshe's life, within a short amount of time we're going in. By the way, notice I said the last year of Moshe's life. Apparently is when the Sefer Devarim begins. So therefore, in the last year of Moshe's life, well, how long or how far are they at this moment from the land of Israel? 11-day journey? I mean, you know there are certain verses that speak about this. So therefore, if there in Devarim we're speaking about what's going to be, and I haven't read the pasuk yet, maybe we should read it. It says that Lo tasun kein l'Hashem Elokeichem, which is talking about idolatry. It's talking about the destruction of idolatry, which is on every hill and under every leafy tree and is all over the place, which means what is there? There's no central worship. Over here, then it says, but lo tasun kein l'Hashem Elokeichem, which, by the way, is a highly debated verse, whether it's talking about the first part or what was immediately before that, which is destroy those places and don't. I mean, some understand this. This is how you know you shouldn't erase the name of God, right? If you were growing up and somebody wrote the name of God on the blackboard, okay, you can't erase it. Can you erase G-O-D, right? Or is that a name of God or not? So all of these things come from this verse. Lo tasum kein l'Hashem Elokeichem. But in context, what it really seems to mean is don't destroy the Beit HaMikdash. By the way, that itself is fascinating. Don't destroy the Beit HaMikdash, like you have to destroy all of the Bamot and all of these places of idolatry. So now, how do you not destroy the Beit HaMikdash? Answer, by behaving. By behaving. If you don't behave, what sin are you guilty of? Which Torah law did you break, aside from all the other Torah laws that you broke? Of Lo tasum kein l'Hashem Elokeichem. So you can say, of course, well, that's indirect, it's a klisheni, you didn't do it directly, and Iuri klisheni, Iuri rishon. You could say what it is, but nonetheless, that becomes more interesting. But to me, I'd rather, instead of trying to figure out what that verse means, Lo tasukin l'Hashem Elokechem, I'd rather note the continuation, Ki im ela makom asher yivchar Hashem. That informs what the previous verse meant. And that's why there's this larger context here. Don't do what they do, serve all these places, serve their gods in all these places. Rather, Ki im ela makom asher yivchar Hashem. Now this, unlike the Mishkan, which is a traveling, moving, and again, it gets put in different places, it's one place. Hamakom asher yivchar Hashem. Elokechem mikol shuftechem l'sum et shmo sham. God's name will be placed there. L'shichno tidrishu uvatu shama. You need to seek out that place and then come to that place. Veveta shama. You notice shama. V'chatam sham l'fnei asher elokechem. U'samachtem mikol mishlachitchem asher atem uv'techem asher barach Hashem elokecha. Lo tasun kachol asher anachnu osim po hayom ish kol hayashar be'einav. Which means this is a verse which speaks of central worship. The Rambam calls his whole book about the Beit HaMikdash, Beit HaBechira, based upon this, Hamakom Asher Yivchar Hashem, Beit HaBechira, the chosen place. So when I look at, again, source number 2, Sefer Dvarim, this is a verse which points towards the Beit HaMikdash. If you want, you can easily claim that this talks about Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim obviously is not mentioned. If you want to throw Yerushalayim into it, so then look at source number 3. This is Yeshayahu, speaking of the future. V'yo ba'achrit hayamim. You can say, how do I know it's the future? So the answer is, because it says ba'achrit hayamim. Nachon yehar beit Hashem b'rosh harim. The mountain which the house of God is there on the top of the mountains. V'nisabek va'ot v'narur lev kol hagayim. Nations, all the nations will turn to this. V'alchu amim rabim. And many peoples will turn. V'amru l'chu v'nanle el har Hashem el beit elokei Yaakov. Right? Why? At the end it says, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. So I hope that no one will miss the reference over here. So again, if I just follow the path, we have a Mishkan, which we're not exactly now sure what to do with. Why now? Why all this involvement? Why not just go immediately to Eretz Yisrael? Again, for Rashi, it's not a question. Because for Rashi, actually, why are we building it now? Because we're not going. Meaning, you can argue, according to Rashi, if he is, have to really be careful. Is Rashi aware of Sefer Dvarim? No, of course Rashi is aware of it. But does Rashi think Sefer Dvarim is something that should be considered together when we're looking in Sefer Shemot? And that's certainly reasonable. So when I said before that some people can overstate Rashi and say, well, if there was never a Cheter Egel, there never would have been a Mishkan, so that if you know about Sefer Dvarim, then you could say there never would have been a traveling Mishkan. But there would have been a Beit HaBechira. Right, and again, that seems to emerge, and that's part of, again, it's part of Judaism from the time, let's say, David HaMelech, and according to the Gemara, David and Shmuel, they see the place, they search the place, they seek the place, they find the place, and then eventually it gets built. And as I said in Yeshayahu, it becomes very, very clear there is this place, and this place is Jerusalem, Ki mitzion tetzei Torah udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. We then have one more verse to consider. And this will be our, again, it's really 3 different approaches. Again, one is the Mishkan, where we started. The second was Beit HaBechira, which is informed or explained by that verse in Yeshayahu. Yes, that's Yerushalayim. It's Ki mitzion tetzei Torah udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. But the other thing that at least has to be considered is source number 4. Source number 4, and it's very easy to ignore this, and it's very easy not to consider it, and it's very easy to try to make it disappear. And then it will be very easy to reinterpret it. But let's first see what it says. This is Perek Kaf in Sefer Shemot, which means where are we? We've just now regressed 2 weeks. We've gone back to the end of Parsha Yitro. Immediately prior to this is the Aseret HaDibrot. Mizbach Adama Ta'aseli. This is right after those verses where the people are afraid, they move back, Moshe speak and whatever, and this is what he speaks, right? Mizbach Adama Ta'aseli, make for me a Mizbeach out of Adama, earth, Vizavachta alav, and upon it you will bring your offerings, Olotecha ve'et shlamecha et sonecha et bikarecha. So I just want to pause for a moment. This idea of building a Mizbeach and bringing in Ola, Shlamim, and so on, this is said immediately after Aseret HaDibrot. This is before any Cheta Egel, and we're told to make a Mizbeach. But the second half of that pasuk is the one that we need to understand. It says, B'chol hamakom asher askir et shmi avo elecha uverchticha. In every place where my name is going to be mentioned, I will come and bless you. V'im mizbach avanim taseli, you just now said to make one of Adamah, but if you make one of Avanim, lo tibne eten gazit, ki charbecha hinafta aleh v'techal aleh. And again, when you're making this mizbeach, make sure that when one climbs upon it, it's done in a chaste way. So when we're reading this, again, it's easy to skip. We have so much other things going on in Yitro. We have Yitro, we have the first part of Yitro, the second part of Yitro, when he arrives and arranging the courts, and then we have the preparations for Har Sinai, and then we have the Aseret HaDibrot, and then we have the response afterwards, and then we have these couple of verses over here at the end, which of course I hope you appreciate, are so easy then to skip. Rashi explains this, and he says, any place that you're allowed to say the Shem Mefurash. By the way, that already is a hint. Because where are you allowed to say the Shem Mefurash? And the answer is the Beit HaMikdash. So again, various discussions about this. But when the Kohanim, for example, were to give Birkat Kohanim, say Birkat Kohanim in the Beit HaMikdash, they said the Shem Mefurash. In outside, and that's Avoda. That's Avoda. Part of the Avoda is not just to bring a Korban and the Shem Mefurash. When the Kohen Gadol, now think about the Avodah Yom Kippur, Kohanim and so on, the Kohen Gadol, Atzer Hashem HaMefurash, Yotzei Mipi, and our response is to bow down and to say, Baruch Shem, to what Shem? The Shem Mefurash. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchut Olam Ved. So Rashi over here is saying, any place my name is mentioned, that's the Shem Mefurash. But again, that is part of what the Beit HaMikdash is about. And Rashi writes over here towards the end, V'zehu Beit HaBechira. So what Rashi just now did is he connected, right? This could be subtle if you don't understand it. If you understand it, it's not subtle. Did you all follow it, what he just now did? This verse, immediately after Aseret HaDibrot, the instructions they have are about building the Beit HaMikdash. So just in case you want to say, according to Rashi, the whole idea of building a sanctuary is because of the Cheta Egel, well, you actually have a... No, to build a Beit HaMikdash, but not to... I know that, what I'm saying is, if you want to claim that according to Rashi, there never would have been a Beit HaMikdash, you can't say that. That's exactly my point. Other than other verses as well, you can go back and look at Oz Yashir, you can see mentioning El Nevei Kachecha, you can see Mikdashecha Hashem. I mean, there are references before to the Beit HaMikdash. There are references in Parshat Mishpatim as well. Then you get into a problem when that's said, because it talked about the Bikurim and bringing the Bikurim up to Beit Hashem, which means the idea of there being a Beit HaMikdash, prior or part of the original plan, I don't think is such a hard argument. But I'm just noting over here, again, I gave you the answer before I asked the question. That's why I say, no, you can't say that. That's exactly my point. There are those who will overstate Rashi. Some of the commentators on Rashi will overstate Rashi and will try to put forth an argument. Had there not been a Cheta Egel, there wouldn't have been Mishkan, there wouldn't have been a Beit HaMikdash. We wouldn't need all of this. Therefore, all of this is a concession to frailty of man. Again, you can continue along the way, that some say within the Rambam. I know why some will say in the Rambam, because there's some things in the Moreh Nevuchim, but not what the Rambam says in the Mishnah Torah. Korbanot as well is a concession. All kinds of things are concession to man. But Rashi thinks that this is talking about the Beit HaMikdash. Very good. One could ask a question. If it's talking about the Beit HaMikdash is Hamakom Asher Yivchar Hashem. It's a specific place. I mean, just read back the verses or the description in Devarim. El hamakom asher yivchar, l'sum et shmo sham, l'shichnot tidrushu v'vata shama. So, how exactly do you take our Devarim formulation and then read it in to our Shemot formulation, where it speaks instead about B'kol hamakom asher askir et shemi, avoy lech v'rachticha. Because that sounds like in any place, and that is a specific place. So even though Rashi gave us a very nice interpretation, we should still feel a little discomfort with that, because essentially, what do we do with our interpretations? We want them to read very nicely back into the verses. You don't want to need to use, what should we call this? Intellectual agility to read it back into the verses. And you needed some agility here because it doesn't read back as simply as you would think. Now, a number of other commentaries are going to say something else where clearly they're troubled by the point I just now raised, and you'll see how, what the solution is. Starting with Ibn Ezra, he says all these places, Kimo, Shiloh, Vinov, Sha'amad Sham Ha'aron. Remember, the Aron is going to be made, we know this later, it's going to be made to carry, to go from place to place, and that is one of the first things we're told about the Mishkan. But no, meaning, again, that's the functionality. The functionality of the Mishkan is the Aron could be taken. He goes, yeah, but the Aron's going to be placed in different places, as it was along the way. The Bechor Shor just throws in one more place, which we like, Kagon B'Shilo B'Nov V'Givon. Why do we like Givon? No, because I live there. Okay. Okay. Givat Zev is built on, or at least close to, ancient Givon. I think the first or second year I lived, the first Purim that I lived there, I gave a shir on all the reasons why we should keep, not Yudalin, you should keep Tedvav based upon Givon, but it was Purim Torah. I'm just telling you it was Purim. I could make a very strong argument, but it was Purim Torah. Unfortunately, there are others who have gone for this Purim Torah, and they think, part of the question is, was Givon itself a walled city? And the answer is it most likely was. But there's a bit more to the equation than that. I did speak to Rav Lichtenstein when I first moved there, and he said, it is not in the interest of halacha to apply a question of safek to new places. We have a tradition of safek. We don't create new sfekot. So a place that has a tradition of reading both days, because it wasn't clear enough to get rid of Yudalid, but there are people in Givat Zev who will read both days. In Ramot Dalid, well, Ramot has a whole history to it. When Ramot was first, again, let's be honest for a second. Almost all of Yerushalayim is not Yerushalayim. You know that, right? It's not the walled city, so you can say it's Samech V'Nira. Pisgat Zev is Yerushalayim. I don't know how that's Samech or Nira for that matter. So when Ramot was built, because Ramot is high, that's why it's Ramot. So Ramot can actually see pretty far, and the question came up, and it became a big argument. So Rav Tuvia, what was Rav Tuvia? Wasn't Rav Tuvia Weiss? It was, I believe. No, not Russia. It was Rav Weiss, who was the head of the Eidah. Was it the head of the Eidah? Am I right about that? I'm pretty sure that he had said that it is not part of Yerushalayim, and they should read on Yudalid. And Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach said, but it's Samech V'Nira, and they should read on Tedvav. So then somebody had the chutzpah to ask Rav Shlomo Zalman, so what should we do? Should we listen to you or listen to him? So he said, well, the head of the Eidah is the chief, they hold themselves to be the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim. So he's the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim, but he holds it's not Yerushalayim. So it's not Yerushalayim, you don't have to listen to him. So therefore he has no authority over here, so therefore you should listen to me. That was Shlomo Zalman's response to the question. And it's good to have questions about Purim that are in the Purim spirit. In source number 8, Rav Avram ben Rambam says that his father, he doesn't quote his father all the time, but Kol Makom Asher Eskir, Amar, sorry, I take this back, not his father, his grandfather. Amar Avi Abba, my grandfather, Maimon, said, Remez al Shila v'no v'givon u'beit olamim, which is great, because he says all the places, so what are all the places? Wherever the Aron had stopped properly, and that's Shila, Nov, Givon, and the Beit HaMikdash. He quotes Rav Sadia, and then he says, Va'ani Omer, and this is going to be different. Va'ani Omer, Ki bo ladati tam acher hainu ki sheta'avdu li b'haskarati gam bilti korban eskor zeh va'avo aleichem. He says it includes worship of God even without a korban. It includes when you pray. Klomar, look at the last couple of words, avodat, halev, prayer. That's also avoda. We sometimes think about avoda, okay, we don't bring korban anymore, we pray. And he's saying, no, I think that this is what this pasuk means. Kol makom asher skir shemi, wherever you mention my name, you daven, you pray. So God says, I will respond to your prayers. And he sees this, as a drama which takes out, a spiritual drama which takes out what we can pray to God. By the way, that just completely opens it. That's not just you can only pray to God in Shiloh. You can only pray God to Nov or Givon or Yerushalayim for that matter. And that just, if you think about this now, this is the polar opposite of what Rashi had said. Right? What was Rashi's opinion? That it's only, right? It is the Beit HaBechira. That's where you can say the Shem HaMefarash. He kind of got rid of the Shem HaMefarash within this and says, wherever you say God's name, you reach out to God and you pray, that's where this is going to apply. So all of this was the introduction. How long was our introduction? Almost half an hour. All of this was the introduction in order to get to the Sforno. The Sforno is the one who is completely radical and sees everything differently. And now the only question is how many different comments of the Sforno we're going to see, and how much we'll be able to unpack, and how much we'll understand within this. And in case some of you are wondering, we have done this before in terms of trying to understand the Sforno's approach. The problem with it is that there are multiple pieces to it, and to try to put all of it together is beyond one shiur. It's probably a series of shiurim to understand it. I'll say a second thing. There's a wonderful edition of the Sforno. There's a whole bunch of them, by the way. There's a wonderful edition from Rav Kupperman from the Mechlala fame, published Misha Chachma. And he actually wrote another book, which was a book about Parshanut. And like each parsha, there's like a little, I don't want to say a vort, it's Dvar Torah. Meaning, I guess he had enough good things to say, and you can't throw everything into your footnotes along the way. And he wrote a number of chapters in that book about the Sforno's approach. And certain things I'm saying I got from Rav Kupperman, I'm just going to say straight off, give him credit. And there's certain things that I went a little bit further than he said. If it's important to you, I can try to find a demarcation between the two. But let's begin. Over here, on that pasuk, Atem re'item ki min hashamayim dibarti imachem. First of all, he went back a couple of verses. I'm in source 9. He went back a couple of verses, which means we're in Shmot, but it's not immediately from the verses that I began. I began in source 4 with Mizbach Adama, that's Pasuk Kaf Aleph. He's going back ever so slightly and says, Pasuk Yutet, you saw that I spoke from heaven, and what does it then say? Lo ta'asun iti, don't make icons. And then it says, Elohei kesef le'zahav, or Elohei kesef lo ta'asun, don't make any gods of gold or silver. Which right there, if you don't know, you look at Rashi, and Rashi is troubled by something. How in the world do we make icons in the Mishkan? How do we make kruvim? How can we? And Rashi gives a quote unquote Simon Says answer. That I said to do it like this, so then it's okay. But if you did it like that, then it would not be okay. But that doesn't answer the problem in terms of essence, in terms of the Hebrew would be the mahut. What exactly is the difference over here? And that's a little troubling. So the Sforno is starting back over there. Lo tasuniti Elohei kesef ve'acha shera'item she'ein atem tzrichim le'emtzaim letkarev elai. You do not need any kind of intermediary in order to get close to me. Why? Because you were just by Sinai. And what happened at Sinai? The heavens opened up and there was a revelation and God spoke. So you see that revelation is possible without anything. So now when I say without anything, what is he including? He's including icons. He's including all kinds of things from gold and silver. And now you just have to kind of ask yourself a question, unless you're too afraid to ask this. And how do we start this week's parsha? V'chuli Terumah. And what kind of things are you giving? Zahav, Kesef, and Nechoshet. So he's just now saying that right after Har Sinai, there's a verse. You saw. By the way, again, look how he connected it. You saw that I spoke to you from heaven. Don't make any kind of icons. And then what does it continue to say? Make a mizbeach out of Adamah. Right? By the way, what's missing there? The Mishkan. What else is missing? The Beit HaMikdash. What else? Like everything is missing. So I think I gave you enough information to start understanding this. Mizbach Adama Taseli, continue Pasuk Aleph in the Sforno. V'gam kein lo titztarech lasod hechalot shel kesef v'zahav v'avanim yikarot leman ekarev aleichem. You don't need to build edifices, you don't need to build buildings, you don't need gold and silver and stones and any of this. Aval yaspik Mizbach Adama. All that you need is a modest little mizbeach made out of earth. That's all that you need. So if you're looking for somebody to say, oh, we don't need the Beit HaMikdash, again, just now think about what I said Rashi doesn't say. Well, the Sforno says it. I mean, the Sforno is saying that I don't need that. V'kol makom asher eskir et shmi, she'evchar lebeit vad la'avdi. Then you'll say, hold it. A place for my servants to gather. Kinyan eskot k'znav shmi avo elechem v'otecha lo titzterech lemshoch hashkachati elechem be'emtzaim shel kesef v'zahav. You will not need to build anything out of gold and silver. Rather, I will come and I will bless you. We can keep on going along this way. There was a really important term, which I'll say it again, could be a shir by itself, and that was that turn of phrase at the end of Pasuk. You don't need ke'ela le'emtzaim, and he'll speak various places, a whole bunch of places, about what does this mean to have an emtza'i. How do you want to turn emtza'i, where you have an intermediary to somehow, for God to reach you or for you to reach God. He's saying, no, you don't need all of that. That there should have been, or there could have been, or there was once, a much more direct mode of communication. So if you don't realize already that he's being somewhat radical. Now, my imagination, and I didn't see, or either I didn't see anybody say this, or I can't recall anybody saying this, including Rav Kupperman. If you don't know this about his biography, he lived in Italy. By the way, a lot of it's not just good fashion, and food comes from Italy. Very creative commentaries are Italian, yes. And he's creative. He lives a number of years within the shadows of the Vatican. And one wonders, that's what I'm saying. I don't know if I saw anybody discuss this. I can't find it. One wonders to what extent he sees the spiritual corruption of all of the wealth of the Vatican, and saying true holiness does not need gold, and true spirituality does not need silver, and true holiness does not need to build these big buildings and so on. And rather he's saying that true holiness is what happened at Sinai. And there was no intermediaries, there was God opening up from the heavens. Now the question is, now how does that continue? I mean, the Ramban's point is, how do you continue that? You build the Mishkan. How do you continue that? Then you have the Beit HaMikdash. Rashi's point seems to be, how do you continue that? Well, we should have just had the Beit HaMikdash, but okay, we're going to end up being a long time in the desert, so therefore we need a Mishkan. But the Sforno seems to be saying, oh, we shouldn't have had anything, which therefore, what should we do next? You should go to source number 10. And this is the Sforno where? In this week's Parsha. ושכנתי בתוכם ככל שאני מראה אותך, אשכון ביניהם לקבל תפילתם ועבודתם. So it's interesting. But by the way, this should remind you also of Avram ben Arambam. Remember he said that wherever my name is mentioned, I'll come by prayers. And he says that אשכון ביניהם לקבל תפילתם ועבודתם באותו האופן שאני מראה אותך בשכינתי בהר על הכפורת בין שני הקרובים עם תבנית המשכן ועם תבנית כל כליו. כי אמנם תבנית המשכן TORAH על הקרובים שהם שרפים עומדים ממעל, הנראים לנביאים ומהם בקודש ומהם בקודש הקדושים. So if you didn't follow what he just now said, he says the Mishkan is built in order to recreate the vision that people have, prophets have, when they see their visions. Now, he just gave the reference in a future direction. This is what Yeshayahu is going to see. And therefore he references the pasuk in Yeshayahu. He continues and by the way, what we should be wondering about, is he only talking about the future, or is he also talking about the past, just in terms of what we just now saw, what happened by Sinai. וכן ראוי בישראל כל קדושיו מחוברים אל המון להבין ולהורות. It was appropriate for all of Yisrael. Can I read the words again? V'chein ra'ui, this is in the fourth line in source 10. V'chein ra'ui shiyu b'Yisrael kol kidoshav mechubarim el ha'amon lahavin ularot. The masses should all be on that level to understand and to give rulings. So we just put all the rabbis out of business. He said the masses should be able to do this. Uvekodesh HaKadoshin matan haTorah toch guf mitzupeh zahav mibayit ub'machutz k'amram b'zeh kol tamid chacham she'ein tocho v'kibaro einu tamid chacham. And he's doing all this in a very symbolic way. We're going to skip a little bit. V'chein ta'asu atem kidei sheshkom betochem ledaber etchem lekabel tfilat avodat Yisrael lo kemo shehaya ha'inyan kodem ha'egel b'kol hamakom avo elecha. So now that's it. The other shoe just now dropped. What did he just now say? That the Mishkan is going to dictate a new type of relationship, not like before the Egel. Because before the Egel, what did we have? B'chol makom asher avo elecha. Which means when everyone else was taking that B'chol makom as being the Beit HaMikdash or the Mishkan and so on, that's what the verse refers to. He says no. That verse referred to what was the reality at that point, but unfortunately, a spiritual trauma took place. We then suffer through this spiritual blight, devolution. Something terrible has taken place. And now the rules of the Mishkan are indicating a new rule, new type of engagement, which is going to take place because unfortunately, the way it was supposed to be has disappeared. So that's a little bit more radical. He continues and he says, "Akruvim kvar bi'aru haneviyim shamalachim b'mar'eh hanuvah nirim lachziram kidmut kurivim." So again, that's why he's talking about the prophets. This is what they see, but he is kind of indicating to us that, again, he's saying that what was isn't, and therefore we need something else. In Pasuk Kaf Bet, which is the top of page 3, asher migmat pneihem asechel v'yadua oto ki shi'ad bi'amro v'shchinati betocham kasher kechol asher ani mareh otcha. So if you notice the shift that took place, and again, that's why I said this deserves time by itself to try to unpack this. Originally, he says that all of us were supposed to be on this level, but now it's only the wise who are able to have it. And that was that interesting turn of phrase that he had in the middle, that the Aron itself should be gold on the outside, gold on the inside, and therefore the person who is the wise person, which means, when I said before, put the rabbis out of business, so Baruch Hashem, there was a Chet Egel, so now you need rabbis again. So that is essentially what he's saying over here, even though he keeps saying that the symbolism of the Mishkan should remind us of what we saw by Sinai. Look at Kaf Gimel, Sita Shulchan, Acher Maseh Ha'aron Shia Kidmut Kisei L'Shchina. Again, the various things that we're seeing in the Mishkan, the Kruvim, the Shulchan, and so on, all of this should remind us. Pasuk Lamed Zayin would not have meant much to you, but again, I gave you a little information to be able to understand this. The Iral of our Praneh, V'zeh Sheyeh Or Neirot, again, talking about the menorah, Hayamin v'Neirot Hasmo, Mechavein El Ha'emtzai, it goes towards the middle, V'chein Ra'ui Sheyeh Inyan Ha'or Hasichli B'chelach Ha'iyuni, V'gam Kein Oro B'chelach Ha'ma'asi. He's talking again about the way, and notice something. He keeps going back to the intellectual experience and the wise people, and just in case you're wondering, in terms of, instead of what? Instead of prophecy and revelation. Sinai was prophecy and revelation, but what do we receive at Sinai? We receive Torah. What happens when we receive Torah? Then we all become wise. But we're kalim, we're utensils to be able to have received this. So now he is speaking about that wisdom and how this, again, the Mishkan is going to symbolize all kinds of things that were and that should be, but the world has changed nonetheless. So yes, the Sforno is complicated. The Sforno is doing a couple of different things. He's told us what was, he told us what is, and he has told us about what was lost to a certain extent. Source 11, Perek Kaftet. This moves on in the Mishkan instructions, where it tells us about offerings. No adati shama pasuk mem shama levnei Yisrael. I'll make myself known. V'kdash b'chvodi v'kidashti talamod v'tamizbeach and so on. V'shachanti betoch b'nei Yisrael v'yiti lahem leilu him. V'yudu ki ani Hashem Elohim asher hotzeti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim l'shachni betocham. I took you out in order for me to be able to dwell within you. What does Rashi say to dwell within you? Al menat l'shkon ani betocham. The reason for Matan Torah was for God to dwell within Jewish people. For Rashi, how does God dwell within the Jewish people? By building the Mishkan or building the Beit HaMikdash. The Sforno says, however, V'shachanti b'toch b'nei Yisrael l'kabel avodotam b'ratzon l'shmoa el et tfilatam. So it's interesting. He keeps going back to, again, it's to take their service, which you could tell me is korbanot. I'm fine with that. But he keeps coming back to tfilot as well. Vayitelem leilokim manhig inyanam bilti emtsa'i. You notice that bilti emtsa'i because that was originally without an intermediary. So we'll pause with that. In source 14, moves towards the very end of the Mishkan construction. And this is Parshat Pekudei. This is where we have the accounting done for what was used, what was spent, where the money went. Eile Pekudei HaMishkan, Mishkan Edut, Asher Pukad Al Pi Moshe, Obad Levim, and so on and so forth. Here the Sforno, Eile Pekudei HaMishkan. We'll see how much to skip. Talmud Lomar Tzeshitim Omdim Shomdim La'adu La'olei Omamim, that the wood is going to be forever. This is the wood of the Mishkan. V'gam kein lo nafal davar mehem biyad oivim. The Mishkan never fell in the hands of enemies. Al hefech ma shekara leMikdash Shlomo v'kelav kimuvor b'churban beit rishon ayidei nevuz daran. Shelo niskar sham davar me'aninei Mishkan Moshe Rabbeinu alav hashalom. He says, notice something. Which was sturdier, the Mishkan or the Beit HaMikdash? And the Sforno just said that the Mishkan is sturdier.
What happened to the Mishkan?
Really good question. And he says, but it never fell in the hands of the enemies. Most likely it was buried. It never fell in the hands of the enemies. Mishkan Edut, Sefer Malot Ze Mishkan Shebishvilam Yorui Liot Nitzchi. The Mishkan should have lasted forever. Which means you go back to an original plan, if anything, the Mishkan is better. V'shaloli po biyad oivim. Rishon Hashem Mishkan Edut, Shahayu bo luchot Edut, Shnayim Hashem pakad al bi Moshe. Because who gave the instructions? Moshe gave the instructions. Which means this is a far sturdier building. And not only that, the people involved in building it, B'tzalel and so on, miyuchasim v'tzadikim shebedor, the great people. Ubekach shor tashchina b'maseh yedeim, v'lo nafal miyad oivim. He keeps coming back to this. It never fell to enemies. Avol Mikdash Shlomo, she'ovdei hamalacha bo mitzur, they imported foreign workers to build the first Beit HaMikdash. He says, even though the Shechina was there, it was not on the same level as the Mishkan. Now this would surprise you, because I think if you would ask most people, no, again, think about the verses that we went through. Right now, it's easy to get fooled by the Sforno, but he's only comparing two things. What's he comparing? The Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash. And what's better? Clearly. Now, you could say, but the Beit HaMikdash is so much more beautiful. It is so much more, it has more, well, it could have more gold, and it can have more silver, and it can have more, proper avanim and so on. And forget about Bayit Sheni. Bayit Sheni lo yabo gam echad mikol eila tanaim lo shotar bo shchina v'nafal b'yod oivim. Second Beit HaMikdash didn't have any shchina in it. And now to say it didn't have any, I mean, it's a very strong statement. But he's saying, what he means by that is that there wasn't any luchot. There wasn't the Terumah, meaning all of the magical things were not there. Bayit Sheni did not have the luchot. Bayit Sheni didn't have the luchot. It didn't have the Urim B'tumim. It was a building. It was a building that they had all kinds of korbanot. And then he says, when he gets to the Zahav, Pasuk Kaf Daled, Kol HaZahav, again the accounting, Hi'id al kitzvat HaZahav HaKesef v'nachoshet shenichnasa b'mlechem mishkan shahaya davar mu'at ma'od be'erech ela osher shahaya b'bayit rishon. All of the gold, the accounting that we had here, was a small percentage of what they had by Bayit Rishon. But nonetheless, v'im kol zeh yoter hitmid mar'eh kavod Hashem b'mishkan shel Moshe, God's presence was always discernible in Moshe's Mishkan, b'ma shehitmid b'mikdash rishon, far more than the first Beit HaMikdash. V'lo nireh klal b'mikdash sheni, there was none at all a sense of the Shekhinah in Beit Sheni. Uv'zeh hara shelo ketzvat ha'osher v'gadol l'binyan, you siba lashrot ha'shekhinah b'Yisrael. And don't think that the amount of gold and silver and wealth which is poured into the building is what brings about spirituality. That's pretty good, no? So people building these big, wonderful, little shuls and so on, he's saying that's not an indication of how tefillot are accepted. Just one more step over here. Yeah.
Also, the first is with the Mikdash, people donated from their hearts. The second one were taxed. The people.
Okay.
That's also.
Source 16 is back in Shmot Yud Bet. Where is Shmot Yud Bet? That's talking about in Mitzrayim, building, bringing our Korban Pesach, putting the blood on the door frame and so on. And, you take the blood, put it on the door frame, and he says that was the situation. This was the situation from Yom HaTorah until Egel. And what is the background of all of this? Without him telling you, it's B'kol Makom. So what's one of those Makomot? In Egypt. That in Egypt, they put the blood on I don't need a Beit HaMikdash. I don't need the gold. I don't need the silver. I don't need the building. So they killed the Korban Pesach and they put the blood on the doorframe. That's no worse than a Mizbach Adama. But he also said another thing. But this was also the situation prior to Adam's fall, which essentially what the Sforno is telling us is that there are two falls of man. There is the fall of man, which takes place when we get kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and something changes dramatically. And then and by the way, the Kruvim are in that story as well. And then there is this fall of man that takes place with the Chet of the Egel, where we lose something. Which means it's very easy to say, we sinned with the Egel and therefore we needed the Mishkan. That's not what he's saying over here. We sinned with the Egel and therefore we lost the ability of God to communicate to us without any intermediary, and we lost that level of communication. He's going to pull out a couple of more things, which that as we get there, they're going to be surprising, but everything's going to fall into place, because I'll say it again, he has this global vision which puts together a whole bunch of different chapters and verses and concepts. Going back to source 17 is Perek Kaf Daled. Perek Kaf Daled Nishmaot is the end of Mishpatim, the continuation of Matan Torah, where Moshe goes up the mountain. But prior to this, we have Vayi Moshe Bahar, right? Moshe goes up. So he says over here that this is when Moshe goes up for 40 days, and Moshe's going to come down. Right? He'll also mention that there's 3 times that Moshe goes up. The first time, the medium time, which is right at after the Chet Egel, and then the third time. And he says that Uve Emtsaim, this is around 5 lines down, first word of the line, Uve Emtsaim, Kafi HaKabbalah, Shahiyu Bekas, Velo Zechuli Not Mikarnei Ahod. That's when God was still angry during those middle days, and that was not when Moshe came down with the glory upon him. That was when he came back down the third time. V'usag ze b'arba'im yom achronim. Uvahem nitztava al melechet hamishkan, and that's when the Mishkan was commanded. To Moshe b'yer ba'omo ve'el Aaron titen atedut asher iten elecha. V'zelo nitkayem beluchot rishonot. That didn't happen with the first luchot. Shelo bo l'shum Aaron elosh shvireim bilvad bilti edut. Now we could take this and interpret this all kinds of ways. He's claiming that God did not say, build an Aron to put the luchot in, because God knows that Moshe is never going to put the first luchot in, because he's going to break those. By the way, I'm going to say it again. You can argue, okay, we're going to put the broken luchot, and that's the original plan, and God's not going to tell him you're going to break them before it happens, but that's not what he says. He says that God would not let an untrue thing come out of his mouth, so therefore God did not say to build the Aron to put them in, because the functional use that I have for the Mishkan is unnecessary, because we're not going to have any place to. We're not going to need to put it any place because they're going to be shattered. He said the testimony, right? Luchan ha'idut. The idut is the words, but according to tradition, again, he just now took a midrash, and he's saying the midrash is that the words floated back into heaven. So he says there's no idut there. The idut is missing. The testimony is missing. So it can't be about that. Now you realize he's not just relying on pshat here, he went a little further. And so on. Now he just went one step further that you may or may not have seen coming. He goes, now, not only do you need a Mishkan, you know what else we need? We need Kohanim. But hold it, we didn't need Kohanim before? He says no. Only afterwards, the Shevet Levi come, and then they're chosen. But he says beforehand, what did we have? 1 second. So if this is not clear enough over here, look at source 18. This is right near the Chet Egel, Perek Lamed Aleph. Vayitena Moshe kechalato, when he gives him those luchot. Over here, he comes back and he says, "Uv'amru mizbach adamat haseli b'kol makom avoy lach." Again, he keeps coming back to that verse, the way it's supposed to be. That there is no mishkan. Ad shetzarach lasot mishkan, until they had to do a mishkan. V'udiya shakara zeh b'sibat roa b'chirat Yisrael. It has to do with, again, the failure of the choosing of the Jews. Ki amnam b'sofa miyon rishon natan luchot masei elokim lekadesh et kulam lekohanim v'goy kadosh kechol dibru hatov v'heima moru v'hishchitu derkam v'naflu mima'alatam. You want English? Do you remember back in Perek Yud Tet, before Matan Torah, God says to Moshe, tell the people, you're going to be for me mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh? Do you know how he interprets that? We were all supposed to be Kohanim. We were all supposed to receive the word of God directly. We were all worthy to bring the korbanot in all kinds of places, because any place that you say the name. Who says the name? Not just the Kohen in the Beit HaMikdash, but all of OUisrael are all Kohanim, meaning he's taking that phrase quite literally. You're all going to be for me a mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. But what happened? We rebelled, himamaru v'hishchitu, and they became corrupted. Darkam, they corrupted their ways, v'naflu mimalatam, and they became, what was the word I used before? There was a devolution that took place. They are no longer who they were beforehand. Now they need an emtsa'i. Now they need something else. Now they need a mishkan because they're not capable of being on the level they're supposed to be. I want to comment on this, but we still have a couple more things to do, but I want to make a comment about this. Some of you will recall or will know that, like, I've said in the past that when everybody quotes the Ishbitzer, I always get very suspicious because, first of all, I don't think people understand the Ishbitzer, but the Ishbitzer, among other things, talks about how mitzvot on Sinai were unnecessary till we got the mitzvot, but theoretically one should be on a spiritual level that you don't need the mitzvot. On the other hand, most people would say, no, the mitzvot is what takes us to the level. The Sforno is not that far from saying a similar kind of thing. What he's saying is that there were people on a level that were able to get the word of God directly. By the way, now think about the avot, think about the imahot. They don't need these mitzvot. But what happened? Why do we need the mitzvot? Because we suffer from spiritual devolution. We have the spiritual blight upon us. There is this fall of man. But what was supposed to happen? Which means instead of Har Sinai being a one-time experience where the heavens open up and we're able to take in the word of God, instead that's supposed to be the ongoing relationship. And perhaps we're supposed to be the Kohanim for the entire world. I don't need a Beit HaMikdash that all the nations of the world are going to come up and say, let's go up to the Beit HaMikdash because we can see some spirituality there. Every single Jew was supposed to have that kind of spirituality as a result of Har Sinai. And therefore, we don't need the gold, you don't need the Zahav, you don't need the buildings, you don't need the Beit HaMikdash, you don't need the Mishkan, you don't need any of this. What you have is every single person who is this Kohen who possesses within them Torah. That's incredibly important. They now have this possession of Torah within them, and they have this wisdom, not just this magical spirituality. They have this wisdom within them. But what happens, unfortunately, is that we became corrupt. That is what the Sforno is saying over here. So his rejection of the gold, and which means he thinks those verses right there, Lo tasuniti, I don't know, till we get to an absurdity. Okay, now you need to build these things of kesef and zahav. Why? Because you have undergone this terrible devolution. The Sforno continues. Okay, we are still in Perek Lamed Aleph, and he says, "V'natati mishkani betochacham, tishra shchinati betochacham b'kol makom shetiyeh kamo sheya'ad kodem ha'egel." That was supposed to be for the egel, but amru b'kol makom shezkirat shmi avoy lecha. That was the situation. And again, he keeps on coming back, and he keeps on explaining this, and for him, this is all very clear. In source 20, in Bamidbar, Kol Ha'edah, L'sharet b'tzarchei avodah, shezeh ra'ui la'adat haSanhedrin lulei avon ha'egel. Again, it goes back, the wise people, had there not been an egel, there just would have been a completely different reality of who the people were and who the leaders were as well, although that probably takes more explanation. Rashi in 21, who's explaining, what Rashi says here mainly in 21, this is coming to the Gemara, he says that the Shekhinah that was by Sinai remained there the whole time until they built the Mishkan, which means what shut down Sinai? The Mishkan. Lo nistaka Shekhinah al luchot ha'achronot shenitan b'yom ha'kippurim v'gam kol yimot ha'charev she'asku b'mlechut ha'Mishkan shata Shekhinah bahar. It was there the whole time. Which means they were still on that level, really, Rashi is saying, that they were able to hear the word of God coming out of the mountain. Ad echad b'nisan, shukam mishkan, v'nisav zazashchinan minahar. Till the Mishkan is built, and then they start moving. And that's where the Torah then continues to be taught. Again, at some point along the way, it's only going to be Moshe who's going to be able to do this. But I want to now move to the Sforno again in source 22. He's talking about Aaron's going to light it. Why does it say Aaron? Should have said the Kohen lights it. Why does it say Aaron? Why does it stress Aaron when any Kohen could really have done these things? The Torah chooses to say Aaron, ki amnam kol yemei midbar. The entire time they were in the desert, haya inyan mishkan bekol yom, ki inyan l'dorot b'yom kippurim. That every day in the Mishkan had the holiness and the revelation like Yom Kippur did in the Beit HaMikdash. Which means, just like he said beforehand, that the Mishkan was holier than the first Beit HaMikdash, he says a weekday, right? A Thursday morning, right, in the middle of Adar, Thursday morning in Adar had more holiness than Yom Kippur in the Beit HaMikdash. And that's why it strengthens Aaron, because that was the Mishkan. The Mishkan was this place that had, and I want to stress again, and for the Sforno, the Mishkan is not what was beforehand, and that's when the word of God came down to everybody. Well, had to be specifically by Aaron. That's why it stresses Aaron, because it's essentially, this is the Kohen Gadol, this is Yom Kippur. Every day in the Mishkan was Yom Kippur, which is incredible. So we're running out of time. We'll say one more thing. If you look in source 23 as well, he speaks of the difference between again, he's comparing them to Kodem Masa Egel. I want to read this a little bit. Moshe, when he came in, he heard the same sound like before the Egel. Vizelo korabe bait rishon. Bait rishon, there was not that kind of continual communication taking place. Kolsh came by chain shloya elamikdash navi. There was no navi even. The Mishkan had the voice of God coming down, speaking to Moshe. So now, what was the first communication that took place? This is just a total trivia question. Very hard to prove. You could claim that the first communication, is the very beginning of Vayikra. You could say that. I think but the question is the timing, which means the problem is at the very beginning of Vayikra, we don't know the date that takes place. And we also know that Vayikra almost has no dates whatsoever. And we don't. So I'm going to say, it sounds like the Mishkan is already standing. But the Mishkan doesn't get consecrated until Parshat Shmini. In Parshat Shmini is when Aaron brings the korbanot, and that's so. Meaning, when is God speaking to him, and what is the content of that speech? One could argue, and I think this is a point Rav Cooperman made, that the first conversation is source 24, which is right after Nadav and Avihu, and it says Zot hachaya asher tochlu, the list of kosher animals. Because again, that's the first thing that we're told. Again, you follow the Mishkan is built, and then we're told about the whole list of kosher animals. It says, okay, that's that day. That's what he says. And the Sforno, this is really the most radical place, because over here the Sforno is going to claim, why do we need the laws of kosher? And for that matter, just in case you're going to be shocked about what I say, so you have to read it. And why do you need the laws of Tarat Mishpacha? And why do you need any of these kinds of spiritual laws? And he's saying because we have fallen from the level that we were at Har Sinai. Just think a second. At Har Sinai, we didn't have laws like this. At Har Sinai, if anybody would have found a wild boar and wanted to roast it and have it for breakfast, what law do you have against that? If you're going to talk about, I know that it talks there about, again, at least in the Rashi, separating from spouses and so on. Laws of Nida are mentioned over there. They're not mentioned until this point. They're not mentioned until much later. Look at this Sforno. Zot chayat asher tachlu. Hine acharei shenatzlu Yisrael et edyam haruchani. When they lost their spiritual luster, shakanu b'matan Torah, which they achieved in Matan Torah, asher bo ayu reuyim l'sharet shchina aleim bilti emtzai. That should be a term that you now know. That they were worthy of receiving Torah directly with that intermediary. Ka'amru b'kol makom. Again, he keeps coming back to that verse. As it says, b'kol makom asher skirat shmi. The same way it will be in the future. But they lost all of that. When Moshe prayed, something was nonetheless, he was able to save something. That what Moshe achieved was at least to have a revelation or holiness via an intermediary, which is the Mishkan. So he sees the Mishkan. But then he continues, because not only, the main point is that we have fallen, we have become corrupt. God wanted to fix our nature, that we can be worthy of eternal life, by instructing us what foods we can eat, v'hatolada, and how we have sexual relations, tolada in terms of children. And then God prohibited the foods which are unkosher, et hanefesh b'midot hamushkalot, ka'amar, and so on and so forth, and then Perush Nitzchiyim, skip a little bit, Ki Kadoshani, Va'asar Hanida V'hazava V'hayoledet, L'kadesh et Hazer L'taharu Mikol Tuma, in order to remove the spiritual tumah which they have. But he's talking about what happened as a result of the Chet HaEgel, which means you can just now ask yourself that question again. According to the Sforno, had there not been a Chet HaEgel, we would not have kosher laws, and we would not have laws of Tarat HaMishpacha. I know all the people who explain Tarat Mishpacha in the most beautiful sense, and I think they explain to every young kala and every young chatan how this is the epitome of spirituality and so on and so forth. And the Sforno is going to say, yeah, it's all part of a corrupt world and corrupt people that need some kind of spirituality, because we lost our spirituality that we had at Har Sinai when we were vessels to receive the word of God, and that has kind of disappeared. In source 26 is the Sforno speaking about the punishments of Adam and Eve after their sin, or the first fall, as it were, and it's a very similar conversation. There it also makes reference to Dam Nida, it also makes reference to food, where Adam's now going to by the sweat of his brow in order to create food. There is a certain parallel over here as well. So again, let's just try to wrap this up. This week we have the Mishkan. collect the gold, collect the silver, give the donations, build the beautiful building, and so forth and so on and so forth. And the Mishkan is just kind of a microcosm of the Beit HaMikdash, which would be so much greater. And maybe the greatest one was even Hordis, who knows, what he poured into it. And all of this, the Sforno is unimpressed and said that that's not the way it's supposed to be. That we were supposed to be the people who were the conduits in order to be able to receive the word of God and have wisdom. And if we had this wisdom, then we would be this people who would be able to exist on this far higher spiritual level. So we lost that, and now God does not speak to us directly, and now we need something else, and now we need this Mishkan. But the Mishkan was far greater than Beit HaMikdash, because there's almost this inverse relationship to the amount of gold and silver and how beautiful it looks. So yeah, the Ramban turns everything on its head, including claiming that in the future, we're going to get back to this level. Now you can now ask the next question. So in the future, you have to eat kosher. In the future, will there be these other laws? In the future, we get that level. So we'll leave it that when Mashiach comes and the Sforno comes back to life, you can all ask the Sforno that question in terms of what his vision was of the future taking place. But again, I will point out that normally this conversation is between Rashi and the Ramban, and we try to think of those two different perspectives. The Sforno is just so radically different from what everyone else says, but he is trying to work in all of the verses to make sense within it. And I hope at least the Sforno made sense to us, whether it's depressing all the devaluation or the devolution that we have gone through. So it just makes us appreciate the mitzvot that we have more, because God gave us these mitzvot in order to become vessels who, even through intermediary, can somehow be worthy to have the Shekhinah upon us in our communities.